80 years before Sauron launched his Great War, Gandalf made a move that would change the north of Middle-earth for decades. The departure of a company of dwarves toward Erebor set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a battle none had expected. The largest goblin army seen in generations marched to war. Opposing it stood a coalition of men, dwarves, and elves. There, numerical superiority met tactical ingenuity. The future of the North was about to be decided. A battle built around force concentration, maneuver, and momentum. This is what happened. In the spring of 2941, Thorin Oakenshield departed from the Blue Mountains and began the long journey toward Erebor. The expedition had been encouraged by Gandalf, who saw in it far more than a simple quest to recover a lost treasure. He saw the potential for a major transformation of the geopolitical balance of Middle-earth. As the company crossed the Misty Mountains, it came into conflict with the goblins of Goblin Town. And during the fighting, Gandalf himself killed the Great Goblin. Forced to flee, Thorin's companions escaped the mountains and continued eastward until they reached the edge of Mirkwood. The consequences of this encounter would prove far greater than anyone realized at the time. For some years, increasing numbers of men had been settling the lands between Mirkwood and the Misty Mountains. Villages expanded, and new communities appeared throughout the region. The goblins watched these developments with growing hostility. Already preparing a major offensive against the settlements of the Upper Anduin, they interpreted the actions of Thorin's company as evidence that the dwarves were acting in concert with the men. What had been planned as a large raid soon became something far more ambitious. Across the Misty Mountains, messages traveled from stronghold to stronghold. The call to war spread through every goblin settlement, colony, and fortress. Mobilization became general. Goblin society throughout the Misty Mountains shifted onto a war footing. The response was sudden and total. Weapons were gathered, supplies accumulated, and the forges burned day and night in preparation for a campaign of unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, Thorin's company continued eastward through Rovanion and eventually reached Lake Town. There, the trading town provided crucial support, provisions, and transportation that allowed the dwarves to complete the final stage of their journey. Soon after, they entered Erebor. The recovery of the mountain, however, triggered an immediate response. Enraged by the intrusion, Smaug descended upon Lake Town. He devastated it with fire, but its defenders stood their ground. Among them was Bard, captain of one of the last surviving companies of archers. It was he who finally slew the dragon. The death of Smaug transformed the political situation of the entire North, and Thorin now sat upon the throne of the restored kingdom under the mountain. News spread rapidly. Throughout the North, rulers and chieftains reacted quickly. The greatest accumulation of wealth in Middle-earth now lay unguarded. In the woodland realm, King Thranduil reacted immediately. There was no time to assemble the full strength of his realm. Instead, he gathered the forces immediately available around his capital and marched toward Erebor with nearly 1,500 elves. On the way, messengers from Lake Town, whose survivors had gathered along the shores of the Long Lake where some fields, pastures, and buildings had escaped destruction, pleaded for aid. Thranduil immediately diverted his march, leaving part of his force behind and dispatching timber and provisions by river, while the master of Lake Town remained to oversee reconstruction before the coming winter. Bard, however, chose a different course. Taking command of the remaining men, he joined Thranduil's army, and together they advanced toward Erebor. Further west, the goblins also reached a decision. The offensive planned against the settlements of the Upper Anduin was abandoned. The armies that had been assembling for months would march on the Lonely Mountain instead. The goblins now saw an opportunity to establish continuous control across the region, linking their territories from the Upper Anduin to the northern reaches of the Grey Mountains. Command was entrusted to Bolg of the North, Lord of Gundabad, the great fortress and capital of goblin power in the northern Misty Mountains. Rather than follow the expected routes, Bolg chose to cross the mountains and approach Erebor from an unexpected direction, hoping to achieve complete surprise. Meanwhile, Thorin and his companions fortified the mountain. Defensive works were strengthened and preparations made for a possible siege. Messages were dispatched to dwarven settlements throughout the north, to what remained of the dwarven presence in the Grey Mountains, and most importantly, to the Iron Hills. Dain Ironfoot reacted immediately, gathering 500 veteran dwarves of his household, along with substantial quantities of supplies. He marched toward Erebor without delay. The plan was simple: reach the mountain, reinforce its defenses, and bring enough provisions to sustain a prolonged siege until additional dwarven forces could arrive. Thus, only 11 days after the death of Smaug, the first armies arrived before Erebor. The Elves and the men were the first to reach the mountain. Negotiations soon began. Thorin, however, had little intention of reaching a quick settlement. Knowing that Dain was on the march, he deliberately prolonged the discussions. When the dwarves of the Iron Hills finally arrived, the situation nearly descended into open battle between men, elves, and dwarves. It was Gandalf who prevented it. He brought news of a far greater threat. Bolg and his army were approaching. Old grievances were set aside. A council was held. The goblin army was simply too numerous to confront head-on in open ground, especially without cavalry. The allies also could not afford to remain in the valley, and where the goblins would retain the initiative. Bolg would be free to dictate the tempo of operations, probe the strengths and weaknesses of the coalition, and attack at a moment of his choosing. Under such conditions, his numerical superiority could be brought fully to bear. The initiative, therefore, had to be seized before Bolg could impose his own terms upon the battle. A plan was devised. Rather than meeting the goblins in the open, the Allied commanders chose to deploy their forces upon the two great spurs descending from the mountain. From there, they intended to strike once the enemy had fully entered the valley below. At the strategic level, the concept was straightforward. Secure the advantage of terrain and preserve the element of surprise. At the tactical level, however, the operation was more sophisticated. What Tolkien describes follows a three-stage sequence that has appeared in military history since antiquity. We will return to this later. First, however, it is worth examining an important aspect of the deployment itself. In many ancient and medieval armies, the most reliable troops were concentrated at the center of the battle line, while lighter and more mobile units occupied the flanks. Roman, Persian, and Norman armies all employed variations of this principle, and this is precisely where another strength of the Allied plan becomes apparent. The Allied attacks were designed to fall directly upon the flanks of the goblin host. Units that would normally serve to screen, protect, or extend the line would instead bear the full weight of the fighting. Formations intended for a supporting role would therefore be forced to act as the main line of infantry, a task for which they were not ideally suited. At the same time, the strongest part of the goblin army, its central mass, would remain separated from the main fighting. Instead of deciding the battle, it would risk becoming little more than a spectator while events unfolded on either flank. The terrain had been chosen and the deployment prepared. But still, the goblins outnumbered their enemies by a considerable margin. Soon, dark columns emerged from the northern valleys. Thousands of goblins and wargs poured toward Erebor. The goblins advanced in a conventional marching formation. Well ahead of the main body rode a screen of warg riders, operating at sufficient distance to provide warning of any threat. Such a disposition offered considerable tactical flexibility. It gave the army space to maneuver or counter-maneuver before committing its main force, following the principle of tactical depth. Under such conditions, the Allied trap would almost certainly be discovered. The goblins would have ample time to deploy into proper battle formation, or simply establish themselves around Dale and along the river, securing control of the battlefield before the Allies could act. It was here that the first phase of the plan came into play. Companies of lakemen had been deployed within the ruins of Dale, occupying the old defensive positions. Their task was not to hold the city, but to draw the enemy deeper into the valley before the goblins could properly assess the situation. To achieve this, they would fight while gradually yielding ground in a controlled withdrawal. The principle was simple. By creating space, the defenders encouraged pursuit. What appeared to be weakness or disorder could easily be interpreted as an opportunity. Yet the violence of the warg riders' assault took them by surprise. Casualties were severe. Fighting erupted throughout the ruins, and many men were cut down where they stood. At several points, the withdrawal came close to becoming a rout. Nevertheless, the desired effect was achieved. The sounds of battle, the howls of the wargs, and the apparent success of the attack triggered a spontaneous advance throughout the goblin host. Warriors surged forward with little regard for order, eager to join the fighting. Column after column poured into the narrow valley. Thus, the first phase of the plan had succeeded. The goblin army had been drawn deep into the valley. It was now time for the second phase. The elves formed the largest contingent of the coalition, and were therefore best suited to pin the goblin army in place. Thus, they were the first to launch their assault. Hundreds of arrows were loosed, spreading death and confusion throughout the goblin ranks, and 1,000 elven spearmen charged directly into their flank. The assault struck with such violence that entire sections of the line collapsed. Formations broke apart, goblins and wargs fleeing before the fury and relentless discipline of the woodland elves. Despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, the goblin army was suddenly in danger. The elves compensated for their inferior numbers through surprise, terrain, the quality of their soldiers, and the momentum of the charge itself. But the goblins reacted. Lines reformed, units shifted toward the threatened flank, and eventually the situation began to stabilize. Yet the elven assault had achieved its true purpose, to pin the enemy in place through close combat. And it was then that the decisive movement took place. This was the third phase. Behind the goblin army, barely restored to order, 500 dwarves charged. At their side came the men of the lake, descending upon the goblin rear. This was the breakthrough. Its purpose was to change the tempo of the battle, while giving an elite force access to an enemy that was already surprised, disorganized, and under pressure. The Allies had successfully established the conditions they needed: draw, pin, and break. The Elves seized the opportunity to reform their lines and launch a second assault with fresh reinforcements, while the Dwarves and Men continued to press forward. And we can also see the other strength of the Allied plan that we discussed earlier, striking the goblin army on its flanks. In effect, the Allied plan sought to force the goblins to commit their army in its worst possible sequence, while allowing the Allies to commit theirs in the best. The charge succeeded. Among the goblins, morale began to fail. Hesitation spread through their ranks. The effect was devastating. Unable to maneuver or properly coordinate within the confined valley, the goblins were slowly annihilated. The plan had worked. While the battle appeared won, and the tactical combination of draw, pin, and break had worked, new goblin forces suddenly appeared from the north. A second army had crossed the mountain passes and now descended upon the battlefield. From this point onward, there is little tactical analysis to be made, and the battle becomes a brutal struggle rather than a contest of maneuver. The arrival of the second Goblin army pushed the allies back across the field. Thorin and his companions emerged from Erebor and entered the fighting, rallying men and dwarves around the restored king under the mountain. Then came the eagles. Soon after, Bjorn entered the battle. Yet even then, the goblins retained the upper hand. Amid the fighting, Fili and Kili were slain while defending Thorin. The king himself was mortally wounded. For a time, the outcome remained uncertain. Then Bjorn broke through to Bolg's bodyguard and killed the goblin commander. Already exhausted by hours of fighting and mounting losses, the goblin army finally broke. Across the battlefield, goblins and wargs fled in every direction as the allied forces launched a general pursuit. The Battle of Five Armies was over, and the consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield itself. The army of the mountains had been destroyed, the power of the Misty Mountain goblins broken. Their losses were immense during the battle itself, and even more during the pursuit that followed. Those who fled into Mirkwood never emerged again. By the end of the campaign, nearly 3/4 of the goblin warriors of the Misty Mountains had been killed. Their strongholds endured, hidden among the mountains, but their ability to shape events beyond them was gone. At the same time, the kingdoms of Dale and Erebor were restored. Together with the Woodland realm, they formed a powerful northern bloc. Men came to Bard from the south and east. Dain became one of the most powerful rulers in the north, and the balance of power across the region was transformed. The expansion of the Woodmen accelerated. Bjorn became lord of a strong and growing people whose authority extended across the lands between Mirkwood and the Misty Mountains. The High Pass remained open under their protection. Trade flourished, roads became safer, and for the first time in centuries, the North enjoyed a level of stability unknown to previous generations. From Erebor, Balin would later launch an attempt to reclaim Moria. But that is another story. What matters here is that the consequences of the battle reached far beyond the generation that fought it. Nearly 80 years later, when Sauron launched his great offensives from Dol Guldur in the east, he did not face a divided north. He faced Dale. He faced Erebor. He faced a network of kingdoms, peoples, and alliances far stronger than those that had existed before the Battle of Five Armies. This was no accident. The restoration of a strong northern frontier had long been one of Gandalf's objectives. Indeed, during the War of the Ring, Gandalf himself remarks that a great battle was fought in the north, and that without it, victory in the south would have meant little. The Battle of Five Armies is often remembered as the final chapter of Bilbo's adventure. In reality, it was something far greater. It was one of the decisive strategic victories of the Third Age, a battle whose consequences would shape the history of Middle-earth long after the last sword had fallen silent.